Hello everyone, I am Dr. Geeta Hegde and today we will be learning about homeostasis. So what is homeostasis? Homeostasis refers to maintenance of constant internal environment of the body. Homeo means same and stasis as in standing. So homeostasis refers to maintenance of constant internal environment of the body. This importance of internal environment was notified by Claude Bernard. According to Claude Bernard, all multicellular organisms, including man, live in a perfectly organized and controlled internal environment. He coined a term where we labeled it as milieu interior. So, milieu interior refers to controlled internal environment. Years later, another term homeostasis was introduced by Walter B. Cannon. So homeostasis, normal healthy living of large organisms including human beings depends upon constant maintenance of this internal environment within the physiological limits. And if the internal environment deviates beyond the set limits or beyond the physiological limits, body suffers from either malfunction or dysfunction. An ultimate goal of an organism is to have a normal healthy living, and this is achieved by maintenance of internal environment within these physiological set limits. Various examples of maintenance of constant internal environment seen in humans are transport of extracellular fluid, maintenance of pH, acid-base balance, regulation of temperature of the body, maintenance of water and electrolyte balance, supply of different nutrients, oxygen, enzymes and hormones, removal of metabolic and other waste products from the body, and reproduction. The mode of action of homeostatic control mechanism is quite complex. This mode of operation is involved through feedback mechanisms and adaptive control mechanisms. Feedback mechanisms are again of two types: negative feedback mechanism and positive feedback mechanism. So homeostasis is the stability of the internal environment of the body. It is not only the equilibrium but also the balance of composition and components of the environment as well as the various physiological variables that influence this internal environment. Abnormal deviation leads to body dysfunction. Feedback system of homeostatic regulation. This is mainly achieved to operate and safeguard a set point, which is a physiological set point which is already set for a particular variable. There are two types of feedback regulation: negative feedback and positive feedback. So let us see how is this homeostasis maintained. So what is homeostasis? Homeostasis helps the body to maintain a stable internal environment or milieu interior. The three main components are receptor, it is also known as a sensor. Second, we have a control center, and third is the effector. So the receptor senses the change in the variable. For example, in BP, blood pressure is sensed by the baroreceptors which respond to either increase in BP, rise in BP or fall in BP. Then this information is sent to the control center, and control center through the effector tries to maintain this variable, for example blood pressure, within the physiological limit. So we have three components of the homeostatic regulation mechanisms. One is the receptor, which is also known as a sensor. Second is the control center, which is responsible for maintaining this particular variable. Third, the control center maintains it through the effector organ. For example, various parameters which are maintained in a body: blood pH is maintained between 7.35 to 7.45, plasma potassium levels are maintained between 3.5 to 5 millimoles per liter, body temperature is maintained between 97 to 98.8 degrees Fahrenheit, venous blood partial pressure of carbon dioxide is maintained between 35 to 45 millimeters of mercury, plasma sodium levels are maintained between 135 to 146 millimoles per liter, plasma bicarbonate levels are maintained between 24 to 32, while blood sugar level is maintained in the range of 60 to 99 milligrams per deciliter. So let us have a look about the negative feedback mechanism. The most commonest mechanism of homeostatic regulation is the negative feedback mechanism, Whenever the variable is raised beyond the set point, the negative feedback mechanism triggers processes that inhibit the formation of the variable. And when the variable is lowered below the set point, negative feedback mechanism withdraws the inhibition to allow production of the variable. For example, if BP is rising above the physiological set limit, then the control center will try to bring it back to the normal, and if the BP is falling severely below the set limit, then the center will try to bring back the BP to the normal level. Negative feedback mechanism. There is a stimulus or a stress which is leading to disturbance of that particular variable. This leads to change or disturbance in the variable. This leads to activation of the negative feedback mechanism. Effects or responses, whether it can be inhibition or stimulation of the variable. Stimulation of the variable when the BP has fallen. Inhibition of the variable when the BP has gone beyond the set limits, which will lead to return to homeostasis. And if the body is not able to bring this parameter back to the set limit, then it will lead to failure or dysfunction of feedback regulation. The various components of negative feedback system include a sensor that will detect the change in variable. For example, for blood pressure, the sensor is known as a baroreceptor. Baroreceptor will sense the change in blood pressure, whether the BP is on the higher side or whether it is on the lower side. Then second is the control center, which will receive this input from the baroreceptor or the sensor and initiate a command signal depending on the variable, whether it is on the higher side or on the lower side. Third, an effector which will bring in responses according to the command signal directed from the control center. Second is the positive feedback mechanism. In a positive feedback mechanism, increase in the variable triggers series of processes that further increase the same variable. So this sets a vicious cycle of activation of the process, and technically speaking, this control mechanism does not operate to provide homeostasis because it is taking the variable away from the normal range. The positive feedback mechanism is also known as a vicious cycle system that terminates only when the stimulus applied to the trigger is either withdrawn or the process itself is self-terminated. There are various examples of positive feedback regulation, and in a positive feedback regulation, increase in the variable triggers processes that further increase the same variable. Most common is the parturition reflex initiated by oxytocin. Oxytocin is a hormone which is released in the maternal body when she is close to labor, and this reflex is known as parturition reflex. When the head of the matured fetus presses on the uterine cervix, cervical distension leads to release of more and more oxytocin. This oxytocin increases the excitability of the myometrium, which leads to uterine contraction. So oxytocin is responsible for strong uterine contractions. These strong uterine contractions help to deliver the baby out of the mother's womb. And this vicious cycle will only terminate, it will continue to act till the time the baby is delivered from the mother's womb. Another example of positive feedback mechanism is LH surge. Now what is LH? LH is luteinizing hormone. This luteinizing hormone secretion is increased in the body, which leads to ovulation. So normally the estrogen inhibits the LH secretion or the LH hormone secretion, but just before ovulation, estrogen provides positive feedback to LH secretion, which results in LH surge, and this LH surge is eventually responsible for ovulation. One more example, the Hodgkin cycle. So this Hodgkin cycle, there is sodium influx which leads to upstroke or depolarization of either the nerve or muscle action potential. Now opening of few sets of sodium channels provide positive feedback for opening of more and more sodium channels, which results in massive sodium influx which is responsible for depolarization. So here, threshold depolarization leads to opening of sodium channels. Opening of sodium channels leads to further activation of other sodium channels which go on opening. Further opening of more and more sodium channels, rapid rise in the membrane potential which leads to upstroke or depolarization. And this will only be terminated when the sodium channels become inactive. Other examples where positive feedback mechanism is used is for activation of the digestive enzymes by pepsin, trypsin, which leads to activation of pepsinogen and trypsinogen respectively. Another enzyme cascade hypothesis of coagulation: activation of one clotting factor results in an enzyme to activate the next clotting factor, and this results in the coagulation cascade. Now, after negative and positive feedback mechanisms, let us just have a look at the important examples of homeostatic regulation: control of pH, osmolarity, water, electrolyte composition, regulation of solutes in the blood like blood sugar as we have already seen, balance of the body weight. Body temperature is maintained with the normal range between 96 to 97 to 98.4 degree Fahrenheit. When the temperature is above normal, body activates controlling mechanisms to increase heat loss through cutaneous vasodilation and sweating. Blood pressure. Systolic blood pressure is kept constant in an adult between 100 to 119 millimeters of mercury, while diastolic blood pressure is maintained between 60 to 79 millimeters of mercury. Kidney also plays an important role, and kidney is an important organ for homeostasis of many physiological variables in the body, such as regulation of blood volume, blood pressure, pH balance, electrolyte composition of body fluids, osmolarity of various fluid compartments. So to summarize, homeostasis is the property of human biological system where the self-regulating process tends to maintain the balance for survival. It helps to maintain the internal environment constant. The regulation takes place in a defined internal environment, and this includes mainly three components. One is the receptor, which will sense the change. Second is the control center, which will be receiving the input from the receptor, and the control center will try to maintain the variable within the normal range through the effector organ. Thank you.